Thank you, and I know I won't get your attention on any economic news until I tell you about the bias. So every kind of bias that you think that exists in the AP football poll does, except there is no West Coast bias. So even though not everybody sees those games, they read the box scores and watch ESPN, get the highlights, and those folks don't get a negative. So here is a picture. I think if you just ask random people what the U.S. economy looks like, they might tell you something like this. I think that is a gross misrepresentation of what the economy looks like in the United States, and particularly here in Utah. And the Lieutenant Governor, I think, did a nice job of that. But here are the things that I wanted to talk about. I'm going to squeeze some of these together and try to help get us a little bit back on time, so we may gloss over a few of these. But I thought about what would be interesting for you to hear, and of course, as an economist, I thought first, statistical analysis, econometrics, maybe define some wonderful words like heteroscedasticity and let you take those home and talk about them over the dinner table. But turns out Bruce Davis knows where I live, so I better not do that. And I thought about talking about local things, but the things that really have the ability to affect our economy are mostly coming from international and national sources. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of those issues. So obviously what's happening with the currency in Europe, the euro, is potentially big for the whole world, and so big for us as well. The emergence of Asia is misunderstood in some ways. There are a lot of opportunities there for American companies in particular. On the national level, obviously, we've got an issue with government debt. We've got to talk a little bit about that. Inflation is something that isn't really on everybody's radar screen, but maybe is the biggest problem that we need to be concerned about is latent inflation once the economy picks back up. Regulation, the Lieutenant Governor, I think, did a nice job of talking a little bit about what the wrong kind of regulation can do for us. And simply the negativity, going back to the last slide. Everybody thinks our economy is terrible. The average growth rate, 2.5% in the recovery, that's the average growth rate in the United States since the end of World War II. And the economy is not doing poorly. It's just that for whatever reason, we're not able to think about it that way. And of course, you're familiar with the things that might be going on with Hill, and that's probably something we'll skip and then talk about where Utah and U.S. comparative advantage exists right now and what we can do to try to maintain those things. So we'll see how much of that we can hit. So you're probably familiar with this acronym. It's not a very nice acronym, but the PIGS, Portugal, Italy, or Ireland, depending on who you ask. Greece, Spain, and of course there are other countries that are involved in there now. They have similar sorts of economic problems to the problems that we have here in the United States, except they're on a much grander scale, not in terms of absolute numbers because we're big, but in terms of relative numbers. So government debt caused by the same factors that have generated a government debt problem here in the United States. Everybody wants a lot of things from the government. They want the government to solve problems. They want the government to give them subsidies. They want the government to cut their taxes. And that simply doesn't work very well mathematically. Foreign banks. The big problem in Greece, one could argue at least, and lots of folks in Germany are arguing it, isn't that Greece did the wrong things, but that the German banks did the wrong things. The German banks lent a lot of money to Greece when they knew that Greece wasn't going to be able to pay the money back. Why? Because too big to fail. The German government wasn't going to let the German banks go under for this, and so they knew they could take very risky positions, get very nice returns on Greek government debt that had to pay high interest rates to get anybody to buy it. And the risk was taken care of by the German taxpayers. The European Union generally is hampered by a pretty poor perspective, I think, on economic growth. Monetary policy is supposed to do two things. As your economy grows, you have to have more money to facilitate all the new transactions that happen in the economy, but at the same time, if you grow it too fast, you have inflationary concerns. Well, the German perspective on monetary policy since the hyperinflation of the 1920s, when inflation was running at trillions of percent every year, has been what we need to have is price stability or zero inflation. We'll target zero inflation and try to make sure that we have a little bit of economic growth to go with that, or just take whatever economic growth happens. And that just hasn't worked very well. So in all of those recoveries that the Lieutenant Governor showed us about, those really were driven by the United States. They were driven by Japan, sometimes helped out by Latin America and Asia. But very little of the economic growth in the world has come out of Western Europe. And that's a particular problem for them as well. Demographics, it will soon be the case in several countries in Europe that 1.7 working people will be supporting every retiree. That's a tremendous burden to put on working people. And the increasing burden on rich countries. The European Union has these internal transfers where the richer areas and the richer countries transfer money to the poor areas and poorer countries. That's called structural and cohesion funds. They tend not to work very well. The Western Germans are still paying a 10% surcharge on their income tax to help out Eastern Germany to build infrastructure there. Well, the infrastructure in Eastern Germany is now much better than it is in Western Germany, and yet that sort of persists. So this is kind of a European perspective that the rich should take care of the poor. And while equity certainly should be a part of any economic policy, when you take it too far, you get what we call in economics a moral hazard problem. For years, the biggest industry in Greece, well, I always ask my students what the biggest industry in Greece is. Any ideas? It's tourism. Also the biggest and fastest growing industry in the world. Tourism was the biggest industry in Greece. Greece made less money from tourism over the years than it did just taking subsidies from the European Union. The biggest source of revenue for Greece was transfer payments, subsidies from the European Union. Now, what does that do to Greece's, self-motivation? It really takes a lot of that away. And so that's part of the problem here as well, and now they're dealing with that on a large scale. The political implications, again, are not very different from what they are here. It's hard to sell real solutions because real solutions are hard. People no longer want to deal with hard solutions. They like easy answers. And then, of course, the European commitment to the idea of Europe as a whole as opposed to a bunch of small countries that happen to be co-located. And that commitment is very real on the part of the so-called core countries, France and Germany, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, those 6 countries that started what eventually became the European Union. But the question is, how much more can the rich countries in Europe continue to pay to bail out those smaller countries? So this whole idea of a Eurozone, a zone that all has one currency, and there are efficiencies from having one currency. You don't have to pay 1 or 1.5% to change money every time you want to trade with a firm in another country. Those efficiencies exist, but what will the euro mean for the United States? Well, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Suppose that all of these countries stay in the Eurozone. That weakens the whole economic base of the countries that are using the euro. It's going to definitely mean that the euro is decreasing in value. And the danger for us, of course, is that makes all the countries and all the firms in all the countries that use the euro more competitive when they're dealing with trying to sell things in countries that would also buy from us. Now, that means Germany becomes more competitive. We don't really compete very much with Greece. It doesn't matter what Greece's competitive situation is. But we compete with Germany, and we compete with Sweden, and we compete with Finland, and we compete with France. And those countries would have cheaper currencies and an advantage on international markets if those countries stay in the Eurozone. Whereas if they leave the Eurozone, it's a more optimistic picture for us because the countries that remain in the Eurozone will have a significantly stronger currency than they already have, which means that the European consumers will find American products much cheaper, measured in terms of euros. They'll buy more of our products. It'll be harder for them to compete with us on costs and so on in third country markets as well. The Asian situation, as I said, everybody talks about Asia, and when we talk about Asia, we mean China. But it turns out there are other countries there, and quite a few people in some of those countries. So the changing competitiveness, low-wage sectors are becoming less low-wage sectors. China is now seeing the same kinds of articles about the negative aspects of outsourcing that we're seeing here in the United States. China is outsourcing a lot of its low-value components and manufacturing to other countries like Vietnam. China is also making great strides in the high-value added areas, steel production, automobile production. So China is becoming a country that is competing with us at a higher level than they were before. Very much like in the 1960s and 1970s, we used to giggle about the quality of Japanese products. And in the 1980s, we wished we were as interested in quality as the Japanese firms were. We have potentially the same problem with China. China is moving into markets and direct competition with us in markets that haven't been competitive before. The opportunity is there also for selling more in China. China's middle class is growing. China has a fairly large and growing group of pretty wealthy people. So our ability to sell there should be increasing. But there are a lot of regulations on the Chinese side and a lot of cultural issues on the Chinese side that make it difficult for Americans to be able to sell. And frankly, some of those difficulties are generated by us not being willing to understand the culture and the other aspects that are needed to sell well in foreign countries. Now that's an area where Utah has a tremendous advantage. The governor had bilingual up here, but bicultural is also another important feature of Utah that doesn't exist for most of our other states. And when we talk about market penetration, I was all excited last week about the free trade agreements finally being signed with these three countries. South Korea is one of those. Well, South Korea, had we signed this back in 2006 when it was done, South Korea would have signed it real quick. Now what's happening? South Koreans are protesting that this agreement favors the United States. And there's some risk, actually, that the South Koreans won't sign it, or that it won't get all the way through their parliament. So, market penetration is a really big issue for us in the United States. We have to figure out how to do international business better. We have to take more seriously these foreign language and cultural issues that keep us from doing well. Asian emergence, again, is about more than just China. China certainly is there. China has some problems that it has to deal with in terms of distributing that income across the entire, more than 1 billion people who live there, and particularly it's very concentrated along the coast. So they have some issues, and I think we'll jump past many of these. Domestic issues, U.S. government debt. We do have this structural problem with overspending. We have an anti-tax political climate. We spent a lot of money on stimulus, and most of the stimulus money went to what we call in economics current consumption. We didn't build infrastructure. We didn't build long-term competitiveness, and that was probably a pretty big mistake. We have bridges in Minneapolis that are falling down, things like that, and our whole bridge infrastructure in the United States is weak. Well, if you want to take that money and do one-time spending, and we can argue about whether that was a good idea or not, I don't think it was, you ought to do it in a way that builds competitiveness. Build your transportation infrastructure. Build your port infrastructure. Build your educational infrastructure. And we failed to do that. If we look at competitiveness in the American economy, medium and long term, we need more capital. We need more of that physical capital, replacing the physical capital that's there. We also need more of what economists like to call human capital and what normal people call education. So, and the governor again, Lieutenant Governor, talked about K-12 education and some of the trends that are a little disturbing in higher education too. And we've got demographic changes and healthcare issues that affect our competitiveness as well. What do we have to do? Well, here's some things that we certainly can do. Developing countries, basic education for everybody. I put that up there because we generally, I think, would recognize that developing countries don't do a very good job of educating. Many of the children in developing countries don't go to school at all or leave after 3rd grade or 6th grade, and that makes them pretty uncompetitive in the global economy. But we could take a look at this and find areas in our own country, areas in our own state, that have exactly the same problem. We need to do a better job at K-12 education, particularly in math and science and those things that are going to be sources of competitiveness for the United States. And we've got to force, particularly our national politicians, to do a better job of facing the problems and coming up with real solutions. And that's been a weakness for quite a long time now. Let me quickly jump to inflation. Low interest rates are obviously partially designed to stimulate the economy. But low inflation rates, in the end, can lead to inflation. And our inflation numbers aren't really too bad. Utah and the United States are very similar in terms of inflation numbers, even though a lot of our other economic numbers look better. Inflation is kind of a national thing because we all share the same currency, so we don't look too different there. One of the real dangers, and in fact probably the biggest danger of inflation, is that it interferes with how the market works. The market's based on the price, and the price takes all this information about all the consumers who are interested in buying a product, all the competitive products, all their different varieties that they could choose from. It takes all the information about all the suppliers, foreign and domestic, all the inputs that go into it, and it boils it down into one little number called the price. And that's a pretty amazing thing for an economy to be able to do by itself. So when the economy works well, firms look at prices, and a firm will say, look, the price of my product is 1% higher this year than it was last year. Looks like that's an increase from my demand. I need to expand. I need to hire, etc. So it's very clear when you have low inflation what an increase in the price of your product means. If you have high inflation, though, if your inflation is 100%, now everybody's prices are going to double every year. So if I, as the owner of a business, see that my prices went up 101%, whereas the national average is 100%, do I really think that's due to increased demand for my product? I'm probably going to assume that it has something to do with inflation picking up a little bit. And so that's the real danger of inflation. Inflation gets in and confuses the signaling mechanism that prices are in the market economy. So we have a reasonably good idea of how increases in money supply translate into inflation. It's not overly scientific. There's a 15 to 18 month lag between when the money supply goes up and when we see the inflation, but we pretty much understand that, or at least understood that. But if you remember back to your Econ 101 class, the Federal Reserve isn't the only group that creates money in the economy. Money is also created by banks. So the Federal Reserve puts some more money into circulation, and that becomes income for somebody. They turn around, put some of it in the bank and spend some of it. That becomes income from another person, and so you get this money multiplier effect. And so banks actually create a huge part of the money in the economy. Unfortunately, the banks haven't been lending as much, and so to make up for that, the Federal Reserve has been increasing the amount of money that they put into the economy. What happens when banks get back to normal lending practices? Now we're going to have this huge increase in money that's not really planned for. It's a potential for a very, very large increase in inflation. So we need to worry about that. We need to be ready for it. We need to be watching for it. And the Fed needs to be able to react very, very quickly. One of the new economic ideas being touted here in the United States is, well, if we got this government debt problem, let's just inflate our way out of it. If we have a lot of inflation, we've got money that we can use to pay back the debt, it doesn't really hurt us, problem solved. I think that's very dangerous because of the interference with the price mechanism, and it just will make the economy not work very well. I mean, why would you take a policy that you know is bad and use it to fix another policy that you know is bad? Why not go back and fix the original one? So I'm afraid I'm kind of out of time here, so I'm going to stop. I'll be happy to give you the rest of the presentation during a break or something like that. But I have been asked to kind of get us back on track here. So thank you for your attention.